What do you get when you give a Karen or Kevin who hates being told what to do access to the internet for about 10 minutes? Well, have a look for yourself.
We are not driving, we are travelling. It is absolutely trespass. You got no jurisdiction here, bros. You got no jurisdiction here. Who do you derive your authority from? Who have you sworn an oath to? There is no queen of this country.
If there's one piece of advice I can give you, is do not try to gaslight your police with some illegal crap you read online, because your results may vary.
Oh, look out. You're under arrest. You're a
These interesting characters are what we refer to as sovereign citizens, known also as Reichsbürger in Germany, and in the USA they're just called citizens, who aside from providing a YouTube hole to go down, also raise interesting questions about social movements and their interpretations of sovereignty within state bounds. Sovereign citizens are a simple bunch, a loose group of vexatious militant civil disobeyers who spawned out of America from the 70s, absolutely hate being told what to do and paying taxes. Somehow they've come up with a few very entertaining beliefs and ideas of sovereignty. The ideology has gone worldwide and of course made its way to Australia, where it unsurprisingly flourishes.
Unfortunately, the Commonwealth of Australia is empty.
Most of their beliefs are similar to the American sovereign citizen movement, but with a few minor changes tailored to the Australian scene. They've based their beliefs, if you can call it that, on superseded legal documents such as the Magna Carta, and twisted the legal interpretation beyond all meaning. Ideas like the government is a corporation registered in America, the government in Australia is an illegitimate power with no jurisdiction, and they can opt out of the laws by not consenting to them or partaking in defined business acts, like driving, paying taxes, or not writing the first letters of both names in capital letters. Their obscure views are quite representative of their anti-government rhetoric. They love to spout pseudo-legal crap trying to disprove the state, then hastily call on the state's laws and powers to protect them after the fact of being arrested and charged in their courts. Now, they seem to be a minor annoyance to police and courts due to their civil disobedience, but they raise some interesting points in sovereignty against the established state. But they aren't the only ones in the sovereignty battle limelight in Australia. The Indigenous people of Australia unfortunately have to share the use and connotation of the word sovereignty with these clowns, with their own sovereignty movement, to right some of the wrongs of past colonisation consequences. If you don't know the rough history of Australia's colonisation and the Indigenous already, I'll give you a quick rundown in the time it takes 82-year-old former Prime Minister Bob Hawke to scull a beer at the cricket. The British dumped prisoners on an island and told the Indigenous, it's ours now. Here's modern government and property laws to manage the minerals we just found. It's all ours now, by the way, you get nothing. Bye. After some hard-fought Indigenous rights battles, they became recognised as people after being a culture for 60,000 years and have now been rolled into being a citizen of a new nation with what some of them perceive as a foreign government. Now, not all Indigenous Australians share the same view of how the relatively new state of Australia should recognise or treat Indigenous Australians, but there is a significant portion of Indigenous who are pushing for some sort of Indigenous sovereignty, separate from the Australian government in various forms. Those pushing for Indigenous sovereignty share similar rhetoric and pursuits with sovereign citizen movements. Here, Senator Lydia Thorpe, an Indigenous woman, giving a speech where she explicitly admits to trying to deconstruct this colonial establishment in pursuit of Indigenous sovereignty.
With colonial laws, I'm here to infiltrate it, to rattle the cages, to destroy the white supremacy that is represented in this place.
Sovereignty was never ceded. A common line in Indigenous sovereignty movement, claiming that Indigenous sovereignty still exists and must simply be recognised by the colonist government institution. But this isn't the only similar rhetoric they use. Let's contrast this with some of the other similar sovereign citizen movement rhetoric. The Indigenous had their land rights extinguished by colonisation, but in a very crafty method of fighting fire with fire, the Indigenous got land rights back through the Mabo court case of '92. By saying if the colonisers couldn't prove they have continuing exclusive rights over certain parts of land, then under English common law, it reverts to the original owner, the Indigenous. That's the basic principle of it. I won't go too much into it. The sovereign citizens just simply declare, that's my land under pseudo-fake common law, declare a new state, stop paying taxes, and brand themselves as king of the new nation, until the government repossesses their property for unpaid taxes. Or waltz into a heritage building and claim it as parliament of the new government. They all received hefty fines, by the way. Sovereign citizens reject the notion of driving licenses, and they inherently reject recognition of the state. Because under their pseudo-law, everyone has free movement and driving licenses and identification are an implicit agreement with the corporation state. So they drive around with self-made license plates and identity cards, then subsequently speed run a simple traffic stop into a violent arrest, or kidnapping, if you ask them.
Hi there, so as I said, my name's Senior Constable Perrin, Tester Glasses Station. What's this you're producing?
It's a notice to you, mate.
For what?
Common law.
Okay.
The Indigenous aren't that extreme, but some exhibit similar beliefs. Indigenous without licenses aren't rare, primarily due to the remote nature of their communities. Some have rejected licenses and registrations as they reject the state. But a rogue Indigenous parliament have started issuing their own passports that were inadvertently accepted by foreign border guards. This bloke was let into Australia not because of this passport, but because they cross-checked that he was an Australian citizen, so they let him in. All this basically stems from the rejection of the Australian state for various means. One through pseudo-poorly applied historical law, and the other by improper seizure of land. Whilst they are wildly on different ends of a spectrum, they share similarities and are starting to join forces, representing the proverbial shit hitting the fan. Now you may be thinking I've just cherry-picked a few similarities between the unrelated sovereignty movements, much like someone who compares spurious correlating graphs to prove an obscure point, but these similarities have become a lot more sinister. The similarities of anti-establishment isn't so huge, but the strong online international and rather flexible nature of the sovereign citizen anti-establishment rhetoric is resonating strongly with heavily disenfranchised Indigenous Australians pushing for sovereignty. It's becoming evident that sovereign citizen movements are starting to target Indigenous sovereignty supporters with their rhetoric, driving them into a world of destructive, conspiratorial social movement. Sovereign citizen rhetoric is derailing Indigenous land discussions, and there are now Indigenous sovereignty activists incorporating sovereign citizen rhetoric. Just last year, a hybrid Indigenous land rights and sovereign citizens group converged around the old Parliament House in Canberra, causing a ruckus by taking over the symbolic Aboriginal tent embassy. And when they were removed by police, one man served pseudo-legal breach notices to the police, demanding they make a $100 trillion payment to his bank account as penalty, whilst the others chanted at the police, calling them pedo protectors and NPCs. They then declared the Australian government evicted from control of the nation at the old Parliament House by setting fire to its doors. The previously mentioned Lydia Thorpe thought it was a good sign of colonialism burning. But there might be a new problem emerging. Both movements are whipping up support for each other, especially for the more obscure and left-field sovereign citizen movement. Not only are the sovereign citizen movement hijacking Indigenous movements, their elevated notoriety from the hijacking might be giving credence to the validity of their claims. Animosity with the government increased drastically the notoriety of sovereign citizens movement, and in combination with hijacking Indigenous sovereignty rhetoric, fosters more recognition of this hilarious yet toxic movement. Unbounded by borders, sovereign citizen ideology is constantly adapting to the relative discourses in the mainstream, presenting a moving target for authorities to counter. Their ideas of sovereignty aren't always obscure when compared with other examples of sovereignty around the world that aren't bound by borders of specific territories. The Native Americans have specific rights regardless of jurisdiction within the country. Diplomats and embassies are considered sovereign entities in other countries. New countries were created sometimes because a group of people told the hegemony to get lost, cough Switzerland, albeit the sovereign citizens aren't really concerted in their effort for a new territory. Their borderless ideology may be a global headache for the various law enforcement and judicial systems, but their ideology and measures can be so toxic they take it too far. Sadly, last year in Queensland, Australia, 3 people including 2 police officers were murdered by a trio with strong anti-government sovereign citizen views. Around the world, sovereign citizens are increasingly being placed on watch lists by authorities over their extremist views. The rhetoric they use has numerous overlapping discourses with the Indigenous Australian movements, as well as other fringe extreme anti-establishment views that were all heavily supercharged during the COVID, of course. To summarise, sovereign citizen views are co-opting Indigenous sovereignty movements to create a heinous abomination of crap tacked onto a more acceptable mainstream Indigenous rights movement in Australia, wasting police and court resources discrediting Indigenous movements.